I became enemy number one. Part of the problem was I was regarded as a turncoat. At the time, I felt that the responsible thing to do was to support the consensus. But when I saw those emails, I said, no way, I'm not supporting this. I need to dig deeper. I need to better understand what's going on here. This is more politics than science.
Hi, everybody. Dr. Richard Smith here. I just want to give a little bit of context for the interview that you're about to enjoy. Dr. Judith Curry is a prominent Earth and atmospheric sciences scientist. She focuses on climate and, consequently, climate change. We do cover cycles in the interview, but it's not the main focus of our interview. The main focus is what happens when the lines between science and politics are blurred for mostly political purposes. I think this is an important topic for the foundation because our own founder, Edward Dewey, was also a scientist, but he was in economic sciences. He was a big believer in sciences, but much like Professor Curry, he saw that not only do we need linear, mechanism-focused science to help understand the systems that we live and participate in, but we also need to incorporate natural dynamic variabilities. And for whatever reason, our scientific establishment tends to not put enough weight on these very important topics of natural variabilities because to some degree, they're kind of outside of the control of science. But when politics comes in and mixes with science, we say, no, we can control everything. And that pursuit of control, that fallacy of control, becomes a tool for political purposes more so than scientific purposes. I think that paradox of science and politics is at the heart of why the foundation was created in the first place. And I think it's at the heart of really the deep, profound issues that we're wrestling with when it comes to climate change. So I really appreciated Dr. Curry. I think her new book is fantastic. We talk about that in the interview. And I hope you enjoy my interview with Dr. Curry as much as I did. Thank you, as always, for your support of the Foundation for the Study of Cycles. Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very, very special edition of Cycles TV. I am particularly excited today to be bringing you a very special guest, Dr. Judith Curry. Going to be learning a lot more about her. This is a particularly important interview to me because while the Foundation for the Study of Cycles focuses a lot on markets, we know that our founders had a much bigger vision in mind, really developing a science of cycles, an interdisciplinary science of cycles, a transdisciplinary science of cycles. And so Dr. Curry is a very experienced Earth and atmospheric science professional, 15 years as the chair of the Earth and Atmospheric Sciences Department at the Georgia Institute of Technology, approximately. And really is going to help take us into some different realms today of looking at science in general, what a more nature-focused science potentially has to offer the world, and many other things. So really looking forward to this. Let me just give you a brief introduction to Dr. Curry, and then we'll bring her on and get started. So Dr. Curry is president and co-founder of the Climate Forecast Applications Network. She's in the private sector now, started her own business. Following an influential career in academic research and administration, Curry founded CFAN to support the management of weather and climate risk. She's professor emerita at the Georgia Institute of Technology, where she served as chair of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences for 13 years. And she's a fellow of the American Meteorological Society, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the American Geophysical Union. She's frequently called upon to give congressional testimony and serve as an expert witness on matters related to weather and climate. And she did her PhD in geophysical sciences from the University of Chicago. She was recently included among the 10 most admired women in business in 2023 from Fortune. And she has a new book out called Climate Uncertainty and Risk. World leaders have made a forceful statement that climate change is the greatest challenge facing humanity in the 21st century. However, little progress has been made in implementing policies to address climate change. This book helps us rethink the climate change problem, the risks we're facing, and how we can respond to these challenges. Understanding the deep uncertainty surrounding the climate change problem helps us to better assess the risks. So, without further ado, I bring you Dr. Judith Curry. Judy, thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to get a chance to talk with you today.
Well, thank you, Richard. I appreciate the invite.
And I would love if you would just share with our audience initially kind of your personal story. I mean, how did you get interested in science? How did you become involved in earth and atmospheric sciences? And then a little bit about what happened to you in your personal journey with politics and science.
Well, my interest in science really goes way back to, when I was a school kid. I mean, I love geology and rocks and all these kinds of things. And I grew up in the most boring geologic place in the country, Illinois. Okay, but nevertheless, there was the occasional quarry that I could explore. Then with the money I received for my 5th grade birthday, I guess 10 years old or so, I went and bought a book, The Story of Geology. It was a big geology picture book, and I just poured over that, through junior high school. And this really, this is what really caught my fancy and caught my attention. When I went to university, as an undergrad, it was a course. I was started off as a general earth science major. There was a course in meteorology, atmospheric science, that I said, okay, this is it. I can apply math and physics to the earth science, and I think this is what I want. So I went with the atmospheric sciences, and that went to graduate school at the University of Chicago. And this was in the 70s and early 80s. And my area of research was in the Arctic, looking at the climate dynamics of the Arctic and the coupling with sea ice and things like that. So my whole career for many decades was in academia. I moved around to a number of different universities and ended up at Georgia Tech, where I was chair of the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences for 13 years.
Wow.
And then I took premature retirement in 2017, and this is when the whole politics of the climate issue and cancel culture and all that had gotten really ugly. And I said, I don't want this anymore. So I resigned and picked up my career in the climates in the private sector. About a decade before, I had started a company called Climate Forecast Applications Network. It was fostered under the Georgia Tech Incubator program. The idea was to apply cutting edge weather and climate research to helping people better manage their weather and climate risk. And so once I resigned from university, then I spent full time with the company, and that's what I continue to do.
And there was an episode in your career, right, where you became a bit of a climate celebrity for a period of time.
Oh, yeah. Well, I spoke up. I don't know if you recall the Klimategate episode. This was with the unauthorized release of emails from the University of East Anglia.
Right.
A number of IPCC co-authors were caught out with what I regard some pretty unethical behavior. And I spoke up against this, saying, look, we need to make our data and our methods publicly available. We need to be more honest about the uncertainties and realistic about the confidence levels. We need to stop playing politics with our science. And we need to treat people who disagree with us with respect and try to understand their points and learn from them as appropriate. So,
Mhm.
I thought these statements were motherhood and apple pie, but
It turned out to be
suddenly I
controversial.
became yeah, I became enemy number 1,
And
in
wasn't
the
that also after you had written a paper, I think, after
well,
Hurricane
okay,
Katrina, and you saying about the intensification of hurricanes, and then you were like feted by the global warming industry,
yeah.
right?
Part of the problem was I was regarded as a turncoat because, in
Right.
2005, I had co-authored this paper. Um, for the first time, we put together a global hurricane data set, and we found that the percentage of Category 4 and 5 hurricanes had substantially increased since 1970.
Hmm.
Our paper wasn't a big global alarming screed, but it was published 2 weeks after Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans. And
Mm.
so we received a huge amount of publicity.
Hmm.
And again, the big story was how this relates to global warming. And at the time, I felt that the responsible thing to do was to support the consensus, on climate change, the IPCC and all that. But when I
Hmm.
saw those emails, I said, no way, I'm not supporting this. I need
Mm.
to dig deeper. I need to better understand what's going on here. This is more politics than science. So that started
Okay.
me on a decade-long journey to try to understand and rethink this whole issue.
Right. And didn't somebody bring some new data to your attention that changed your own um, views on that particular issue? And you got new data and you changed your
No,
mind?
no,
No.
people, criticized our
Hmm.
study, and they say the data wasn't good enough in the 70s
Mm.
and 80s, and I had to partially agree with that. Maybe it started
Right.
being okay in, say, the mid-80s, and they said, "Well, a lot of this is natural variability," and I started digging deeper into that, and
Hmm.
I do agree that natural variability plays a big role, but this whole issue remains
Yeah.
unresolved because we don't have good enough data going far enough back in time, and there's so much natural variability amongst these storms. It's very hard to tease out a signal from warming. So that's
Hmm.
where we're at right now on that subject.
So have you were you aware of the Foundation for the Study of Cycles before I reached out to you?
No, my first exposure.
And do you know a scientist by the name of Ray Tomes?
No, I don't.
He's the one who told me about your work and got me to look into your work. And I thought maybe you two had met before, but he's on our board, and we're organizing a conference in New York City in June where we have a day dedicated to science and cycles. And he said, you should look into the work of Dr. Judith Curry. And I looked into it and I was like, this looks amazing. Let me show you, this is your book here, right? And these are all of my bookmarks.
All right,
You
I
there
love
on the camera. So I've really been working through that. My own background is in, as I mentioned, decision making under uncertainty. And my nickname after I finished my PhD, because it was on my cake, was the Doctor of Uncertainty.
oh, I love it. Okay.
I love that, and I think so much of what the challenge that we're facing today is really what I call the business of false certainty,
Mhm.
which I suspect you can resonate with. So I would love to have you share with our audience the talk that you gave earlier this year to the Global Warming Policy Foundation. And just to kind of go through how you are approaching climate science today, what we actually know, where the lines are blurred between the policy and the science, and ultimately what's really going on in science today, especially at these big, complex levels. I spent time at the Santa Fe Institute myself. I know about complexity science. And I think these are all really interesting issues, ultimately, that science itself is wrestling with, and that authentic scientists like yourself are wrestling with. So love to give you a chance to kind of go over your work a little bit. And then after that, we can have a conversation about some of these more philosophical issues.
Sounds like a
All
plan.
right. Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to share the slides that you shared with me, actually, and then we'll go through that. Although I have one other slide before we get into your slides. So let me pull that up here. So I wanted to ask you, Judy, this was a headline that I happened to see yesterday. Carbon dioxide levels in atmosphere reach 800,000 year high. And I just wanted to ask you, as somebody with a lot of experience in this field, what do you think when you see a headline like this?
Well, not much. I don't pay attention to headlines, if you want to know the truth.
Okay.
I read the original papers. I try to assess the uncertainties and how good are our measurements from the ice cores or whatever that we're using to infer the carbon dioxide. But, there's a lot of headlines
Yeah.
out there. And this one may be true, but there's uncertainty in the conclusion. Um,
Of
But
course.
the issue is, the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in itself isn't a big deal. Okay.
Mhm.
The issue is, humans can survive in a range of, levels of carbon dioxide, and plants tend to appreciate higher levels. The issue is, does this contribute to warming? And yes, it does. The magnitude is under debate. And is warming harmful? Those are the issues. So when I see a headline like that, just it's really sort of a propaganda tool designed to say, look what humans have done, and with an implicit assumption that this is harmful.
Right. And I appreciate what you said about you don't pay attention to many headlines these days. All right. So your slides.
Okay. Well, to provide some context for climate uncertainty and risks, let's first consider the so-called climate certainties. The Earth's climate is warming. A warming climate is dangerous. We're causing the warming by emitting CO2 from burning fossil fuels. And therefore, we need to prevent dangerous climate change by eliminating CO2 emissions from fossil fuels and other sources. Now, these alleged certainties are associated with apocalyptic rhetoric from the UN and our national leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Here are some favorites. The clock is ticking towards climate catastrophe. We're on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator. Climate change is literally an existential threat to our nation and the world.
Wow.
So, the UN Paris Agreement targets net zero emissions by 2050 to keep the warming within 1.5 degrees. So policymakers and others are grappling with a number of issues in addressing the net zero challenge. These include technical, economic, and political feasibility, the priority of climate change relative to other problems, and the unintended consequences of a rapid transition to our energy systems. Some example headlines. Almost half of UK adults fear falling into fuel poverty before the year ends. Why Dutch farmers are protesting over emissions cuts. Rich countries' climate policies are colonialism and green. And African nations expected to make a case for a big rise in fossil fuel output. So how did we come to be between a rock and a hard place on the climate issue, where we're allegedly facing an existential threat, and the proposed solutions are both unpopular and infeasible? Well, In a few words, we've put the policy cart before the scientific horse. In the 1980s, the UN Environmental Program was looking for a cause to push forward its agenda of eliminating fossil fuels and anti-capitalism. With the help of a small number of well-positioned activist climate scientists, a 1988 UN conference in Toronto recommended that the world reduce CO2 emissions by approximately 20% by the year 2005 as an initial global goal. The implicit assumption was that the small amount of warming observed over the previous decade was caused by emissions and that warming was dangerous. 1988 was the year that the UN established the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. The first assessment from IPCC in 1990 concluded that the recent warming was within the magnitude of natural variability. Well, that didn't hinder the UN. They went ahead with the 1992 treaty from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that was signed by 196 countries, including the US, to prevent dangerous anthropogenic climate change caused by emissions. The second IPCC assessment report in 1995 found pretty much the same thing as the first one. However, in the meeting with policymakers to write the summary, there was substantial pressure for a stronger finding. They came up with the word discernible and then went back and changed the body of the report to be consistent. At that point, the IPCC lost any pretense of being independent or uninfluenced by politics. Apparently, discernible was sufficient to justify the Kyoto Protocol. So a lot of what you see in climate science and the IPCC is policy-driven science.
That's a really incredible statement that that 1990 statement, the size of the warming is broadly consistent with predictions of climate models, but also of the same magnitude as natural climate variability.
Yeah, I mean this is back when they were pretty objective. The first assessment report was pretty objective. It was following that.
Mm-hmm.
There was increasing pressure to, find something, that we can use to sound the alarm over.
Wow. Incredible.
Okay, well, a number of leading scientists were deeply concerned at the time. Pierre Morel, director of the World Climate Research Program, had this to say: "The consideration of climate change has now reached the level where it's the concern of professional foreign affairs negotiators, and therefore has escaped the bounds of scientific knowledge and uncertainty." Another one from William Nordhaus, Nobel laureate in economics, stated, "The strategy behind the Kyoto Protocol has no grounding in economics or environmental policy."
Wow.
Okay, well, mixing politics and science is inevitable on issues of high societal relevance, such as climate change. However, there are some really bad ways to do this, and we're seeing all of these with the climate change issue.
Mm-hmm.
Policymakers misuse science by demanding scientific arguments for desired policies, funding a narrow range of projects that support preferred policies, and using science as a vehicle to avoid hot potato policies issues so they can claim that science says we should do this. Scientists are far from innocent. They misuse policy relevant science by playing power politics with their expertise, conflating expert judgment with evidence, entangling disputed facts with values, and intimidating scientists whose research interferes with their political agendas. I like this Dilbert cartoon. What does the data tell us to do? Well, we only have bad data. Does the bad data suggest that we do what we wanted to anyway? Well, yes, that's called good data.
Wow.
Unfortunately, we see far too much of that in policy making and even in scientific publications.
One thing you don't mention on here is money.
Uh, yep. I don't think that money. Okay, yeah, money's there, but I don't think
Mhm.
it's the primary driver
Okay.
on either side, in my opinion.
Okay, good.
Um,
Glad to hear it.
okay, so let's talk about wicked problems. Apart from politicization, arguably the biggest issue is that we have oversimplified both the climate change problem and its solution. The UN has framed climate change as a tame and simple problem with an obvious solution that's demanded by the science. The precautionary principle has been invoked in context of speaking consensus to power.
What is
However,
the cautionary principle?
it's that when in doubt, if something's going to cause harm, you shouldn't let uncertainty get in the way of doing something about it.
So you should intervene
Right.
in a
It's a very
precautionary way before you even know what actually might have happened.
exactly.
Okay.
Um, the precautionary principle causes a lot of problems when we have a very complex problem with deep uncertainty.
hmm
And this is what's referred to as a wicked problem. And I think climate change is better characterized as a wicked problem
hmm
with great complexity and uncertainties, plus a clash of different societal values.
Indeed.
Okay, when viewed as a tame problem, the climate change problem is framed as being caused by excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which can be solved by eliminating fossil fuel emissions. So both the problem and solution are included in a single frame,
Wow.
whereby the science demands this particular solution. And it's this framing that dominates the UN negotiations on climate change.
I love how you literally put that in a frame because that is exactly what it is. It's a frame, right?
Yeah. Well, there's another way to view the climate change problem and its solutions. The framing on the right views climate change as a complex, wicked problem. This framing shows two separate frames, one associated with the causes of climate change and the other associated with solutions that can help reduce vulnerability to climate change.
hmm
The larger frame on the right also includes natural causes for climate change, such as the sun, volcanoes, and slow circulations in the ocean. This framing is provisional, acknowledging that our understanding is incomplete and that there may be unknown processes influencing climate change. The framing on the left is about controlling the climate, whereas the framing on the right acknowledges the futility of control.
hmm
Solutions on the right focus on managing the basic human necessities of energy, water, and food. And economic development supports these necessities while reducing our vulnerability to weather and climate extremes.
hmm
Okay, the framing on the left is what the IPCC does, but the framing on the right reflects my own understanding of the issue.
And they're both frames, but they're different kinds
Yeah,
of frames, right?
exactly. You have to make a broad enough frame to include the relevant things.
Yes, we can't get away from the framing problem. We have to frame things, but we can't frame them in a way that oversimplifies the problem and the solution.
Exactly.
Love it. Love it.
Well, even if you don't pay much attention to the whole climate issue, the one thing that you've probably heard is that 97% of climate scientists agree on all this. Doesn't science demand that we urgently eliminate fossil fuel emissions? Well, what scientists actually agree on is relatively limited here. Yes, surface temperatures have increased since 1880. Humans are adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases have a warming effect on the planet. How, However, there's disagreement and uncertainty about the most consequential issues,
Hmm.
such as how much of the recent warming has been caused by humans, how much the planet will warm over the course of the 21st century, whether warming is dangerous, and whether urgently eliminating the use of fossil fuels will improve human well-being. Nevertheless, we're endlessly fed the trope that 97% of climate scientists agree that warming is dangerous and that science demands urgent reductions in CO2 emissions.
Wow. So the things that there is a consensus about are pretty simple and not clear that they really are driving global warming. And all the things that they disagree about are actually the most important things.
That pretty much sums it up.
Wow.
So, how did we come to the point where the world's leaders and much of the global population think that we urgently need to reduce fossil fuel emissions in order to prevent bad weather? Seems kind of crazy when you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Not only have we misjudged the climate risk, but politicians and the media have played on our psychological fears of certain types of risks to amp up the alarm. Psychologist Paul Slovic describes a suite of psychological characteristics that make risks feel more or less frightening relative to the actual facts.
Mm-hmm.
In each of the pairs on the left half of the slide, the second risk factor in bold is perceived to be worse than it actually is.
Mm-hmm.
For example, risks that are common, self-controlled, and voluntary, such as driving a car, generate the least public apprehension, even though you're probably more likely to die from that cause than many of the others.
As
On the
a
other
father of teenagers, that's something I've become acutely aware of, and how
geez, yeah,
hard that is to communicate to my teenagers how serious driving is.
oh, yeah. But on the other hand, risks that are rare and imposed and lack potential upside, like terrorism, invoke the most dread.
Mm-hmm.
So, activist communicators emphasize the man made aspects of climate change, the unfair burden of risk on poor people, and
Mm-hmm.
the more immediate risk of severe weather events. The recent occurrence of an infrequent event, such as hurricane or flood, elevates perceptions of the risk of low probability events. This then translates into perceptions of overall climate change risk. And so our perceptions of climate risk are being cleverly manipulated by propagandists.
Indeed.
Okay, well, the climate crisis isn't what it used to be, which is a good thing, but that's not the message you get from the UN.
Mm-hmm.
In spite of the recent apocalyptic rhetoric, the climate crisis really has been tamped down relative to even 5 years ago.
Hmm.
Around 2013, with the publication of the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report, the extreme emissions scenario, the so-called RCP 8.5, was regarded as the business as usual emissions scenario, with an expected warming of 4 to 5 degrees centigrade by 2100.
Hmm.
Now there's growing acceptance that the extreme emissions scenario is implausible, and the medium emissions scenario is arguably the current business as usual one. And this is according to recent reports issued by the UN negotiators, the Conference of the Parties, since 2021. Only a few years ago, an emissions trajectory that followed the medium emissions with 2 to 3 degrees centigrade warming was regarded as climate policy success. As limiting warming to 2 degrees seems to be in reach, the goalposts were moved to reduce the warming target to 1.5 degrees.
Hmm.
So the most recent Conference of the Parties is working from an expected warming of 2.4 degrees by 2100 relative to pre-industrial, and half of this warming has already occurred. So, I mean, this is really,
Wow.
the alarm. I mean, we're talking about like a third of what we were worried about only 5 years ago.
But then as you said, the goalposts get moved and the alarm thresholds are lowered so that the alarms can keep blaring.
Exactly.
Incredible.
So instead of acknowledging this good news, UN officials continue to amp up the apocalyptic rhetoric. The rationale for continuing to increase the alarm is that the impacts are worse than we thought, specifically with regards to extreme weather. However, for nearly all of these extreme weather events, apart from heat waves, it's difficult to identify any role for human-caused climate change in increasing either their intensity or frequency. Even the latest IPCC assessment report acknowledges this. Nevertheless, attributing extreme weather and climate events to global warming is now the primary motivation for the rapid transition away from fossil fuels. Now, this rationale commits the logical fallacy of conflation. There are two separate risk categories for climate change. The first is the slow creep of global warming, with impacts on sea level rise and contribution to regional water shortages. The second is extreme weather events and interannual climate variability, such as El Nino, which has little, if anything, to do with global warming. So the urgency of addressing an emergency risk is being used to motivate the urgency of reducing the incremental risk from emissions, in spite of the fact that reducing emissions will have little or no impact on extreme weather events. Ironically, it was crazy.
Yeah.
Ironically, attempts to reduce emissions are exacerbating energy poverty and unreliability, which increases emergency risk.
This is one of the things that troubles me so much about this is the emphasis on, how climate's going to impact the poor. And yet when you come right down to it, the things that are happening aren't helping the poor at all.
Exactly. You'd logically think that if warming was less than we thought, but the impacts are worse, then the priorities would shift away from CO2 mitigation towards adaptation and
Right.
reducing our vulnerability and advancing economic development. However, that most definitely has not been the case.
It can be very disheartening.
Yes. So, underlying all this is an important moral dilemma that's implicit in climate policy debates. There's a major conflict between possibly preventing future harm from climate change versus helping currently living humans.
So what are UNFCCC and UNSDG?
Okay, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is the climate
Okay.
treaty. Okay, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is covered in the next slide, um, deals with how we can help currently living humans, especially in underdeveloped countries.
Okay.
So,
So these
so
are both UN organizations, but the one is focused on
right,
controlling climate, which is uncontrollable.
yeah.
And,
Um,
excuse me for
right.
laughing.
So there's a real conflict here. The
Yeah.
UN policies are targeted at possibly preventing future climate change.
Yes.
However, these UN climate policies are hampering the UN Sustainable Development Goals that
Ah,
focus on currently living humans.
let's talk about that.
Okay. So in 2015, the world's nations agreed on a set of 17 interlinked sustainable development goals to support future global development. These goals include, in ranked order, no poverty, no hunger, affordable and clean energy, and development of industry, innovation, and infrastructure. So, why should one element of goal number 13 related to net zero emissions trump these higher priority goals? Well, nevertheless, they have.
Mm.
International funds for development are being directed away from reducing poverty and towards reducing carbon emissions. This reduction of funds is exacerbating the harms of weather hazards and climate change for the world's poor.
Mm.
Efforts to restrict the production of oil and gas is hampering the number one goal of poverty reduction in Africa and is restricting Africa's efforts to develop and utilize its own oil and gas resources. The number two goal of no hunger is being worsened by climate mitigation efforts, including restrictions on livestock and fertilizer. Industry and infrastructure require steel and cement, which are currently produced by fossil fuels. So, neglecting these sustainability objectives in favor of rapidly reducing CO2 emissions is slowing down or even countering progress on the most important sustainable development goals. This statement from a recent UN progress report particularly struck me. Shockingly, the world is back at hunger levels not seen since 2005, and food prices remain higher in more countries than in the period 2015 to 2019. Not a good place to be.
How does this happen, Dr. Judy? How is it possible that all of this focus is on, you know,
Uh,
possibly avoiding CO2 emissions versus
well,
actually solving real problems?
it's the neo-Malthusian worldview and the globalist agenda
Mm-hmm.
that is,
Mm-hmm.
thinks that human health and things like environment and climate change are too complicated for countries to manage themselves. So it's really an anti-capitalistic, even anti-democratic worldview
Wow.
that's ascendant and that's really pushing, it's the World Economic Forum and the UN that's really pushing the climate change issue. Anybody who's working at, the national level or trying to help the situation in Africa, just sees this as, not the thing we should be doing. But it's a worldview um, that,
Indeed.
it's very entrenched in certain circles.
So it's a worldview looking for a problem.
Exactly, exactly.
Wow.
Okay. Okay. So leading risk scientists and philosophers who don't appear to have a particular dog in the climate fight have
Mm-hmm.
expressed their concerns about how all this has evolved and where it's headed. Norwegian risk scientist Terje Aven has this to say. The current thinking and approaches have been shown to lack scientific rigor, the consequence being that climate change risk and uncertainties are poorly presented. The climate change field needs to strengthen its risk science basis to improve the current situation. Political philosopher Thomas Wells has this to say. The global climate change debate has gone badly wrong. Many mainstream environmentalists are arguing for the wrong actions and for the wrong reasons. And as long as they continue to do so, they put all our futures in jeopardy.
Mm-hmm. And the first one was the former president of Society for Risk Analysis.
Yeah.
I mean, risk science is a real thing now,
Oh,
right?
yeah. And it's, in all honesty, modern risk science is only about 30 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And our way of thinking about complex problems in the 21st century has advanced substantially beyond the simplistic precautionary principle that has driven environmental and climate change decision making since the 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a big part of what I did in my book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, is try to bring these 21st century risk science ideas into thinking about the climate change issue and how we should respond.
How has your book been received so far?
I've been very gratified by the reception. It's made inroads. Well, I get emails and LinkedIn messages from people all over the world, which really surprises me. It has been translated into German and French as well. And people from different fields, everything from health, finance, in addition to more scientific and political. I mean, I've done tons of podcasts and I've so much enjoyed engaging with people from so many different fields and with so many different perspectives.
Yeah, fantastic. That's great to hear.
Okay, now this may be this slide and the next one may be the most important slides of the talk. This diagram summarizes the UN view of climate risk. I call this the climate is everything view, based on a recent cover story in Time magazine. Under this perspective, climate change is a big umbrella that subsumes extreme weather and energy policy and causes many of the world's problems. A recent problem that I spotted is that climate change is harming Indonesian trans sex workers. Go figure.
Wow.
The climate.
I mean, if it's harming everything, right?
Exactly. So the climate is everything perspective is reinforced by a broader view espoused by the UN and others that the environment is fragile. There are too many people. Capitalism is bad, and therefore we need global control of these issues. This is, the globalization agenda that I mentioned previously.
Yeah.
So the right-hand figure provides a different view that's more consistent with a human-centric perspective and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Further, this view is consistent with human flourishing and thriving in order to meet the challenges of the 21st century. Most importantly, this view regards climate change, extreme weather, and energy policy as three different issues, albeit with a small overlap. Energy policy is regarded as primary, since abundant energy, among other things, is needed to manage whatever challenges from climate change and extreme weather that we may face in the future, not to mention to spur human development and innovation. So once we separate the incremental risk of warming from the emergency risk associated with extreme weather, the problems and their solutions become more tractable.
Local problems, reduce vulnerability, anti-fragility. I love it. Not what the UN is focused on, at least the UNFCCC, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so my book argues for a reset of climate and energy policy that's consistent with the human-centric perspective. First, we need to face some inconvenient truths about climate risk. Risks from climate change and extreme weather are fundamentally local. The risks are entwined with natural climate variability, land use, and societal vulnerabilities. Blaming weather catastrophes on fossil fuel emissions deflects from the real causes of our vulnerabilities, which includes poor risk management and bad governance. And finally, many people fear a future without cheap, abundant fuel and continued economic expansion far more than they fear climate change.
Mm-hmm.
There are also inconvenient truths about the UN climate and energy policies. The urgency of meeting net zero targets is causing us to make bad choices about future energy systems. Wind and solar power are impairing grid reliability and increasing the cost of electricity.
Mm.
If we somehow reach net zero by 2050, we'll notice little, if any, change in the climate before 2100 relative to natural climate variability. And finally, we can't control the climate or extreme weather events by eliminating emissions. We just need to disabuse ourselves of this idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, given that the UN has mischaracterized climate risk, it'll come as no surprise that we are mismanaging climate risk. The left-hand side of the slide summarizes elements of the UN approach to climate risk management. The right-hand side of the slide is a perspective that I describe in my book, Informed by Modern Risk Science. This includes elements of what has been called climate pragmatism and decision-making under deep uncertainty. On the left, we have a tame problem, while on the right, we have a wicked problem. On the left, we have a global problem and a global solution, while on the right, problems and solutions are regional.
Mm-hmm.
The left-hand side seeks to control the problem, while the right-hand side seeks to understand the problem and manage its impacts. On the left, the focus is agreeing on the problem, while the right focuses on agreeing on no-regret solutions. On the left, there's a focus on consensus and speaking consensus to power, while the right-hand side acknowledges uncertainties and disagreements and incorporates that into the decision-making process.
Mm-hmm.
On the left, we have the precautionary principle, while on the right, we have robust decision-making. The UN strategy imposes targets and deadlines, whereas the strategy on the right uses adaptive management that is flexible and incorporates new understandings as they become available. In terms of politics, the UN strategy has been deeply polarizing, whereas the strategy on the right seeks to secure the common interests of communities. Very different approaches. Okay, so once you separate energy policy from climate policy, the way forward for energy policy is fairly straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next. A more pragmatic approach to dealing with climate change drops the timeline and emissions target in favor of accelerating energy innovation. The goal is abundant, secure, reliable, cheap, and clean energy. The energy transition can be facilitated by accepting that the world will continue to need and desire much more energy. This isn't just to electrify Africa, but also artificial intelligence, robotics, and all the advances we're looking to move us forward in the 21st century.
Absolutely.
We need to remove the restrictions on near-term targets for CO2 emissions. And we need to develop a range of options for energy technologies. Wind and solar just aren't cutting it. We should use the next 2 to 3 decades as a learning period with intelligent trial and error. And evaluate the technologies holistically for abundance, reliability, life cycle costs, environmental impacts, and land and resource use.
And when you say that, there is a framework for holistic evaluation these days, right?
Oh, for sure, for sure. And without focusing on CO2 emissions, odds are this strategy will lead to cleaner energy by the end of the 21st century than by urgently attempting to replace fossil fuels with wind and solar.
Right.
Okay, now we talked about wicked problems. So wicked science is a sort of a new idea, and it's how we can more sensibly deal with wicked problems.
Mm-hmm.
The wickedness of the climate problem is related to the duality of science and politics in the face of an exceedingly complex problem. There are two common but inappropriate ways of mixing science and politics. The first is scientizing policy, which deals with intractable political conflict by transforming the political issues into scientific ones. The problem is that science isn't designed to answer questions about how the world ought to be, which is the domain of politics.
Mm-hmm.
The second is politicization of science, whereby scientific research is influenced or manipulated in support of a political agenda. We've seen both of these inappropriate ways of mixing science and politics in dealing with climate change. There's a third way, which is known as wicked science. Wicked science is tailored to the dual scientific and political natures of wicked societal problems. Wicked science uses approaches from complexity science and systems thinking in a context that engages with decision makers and other stakeholders. Wicked science requires a transdisciplinary approach that treats uncertainty as of paramount importance. What we disagree on and the uncertainties, are key elements here.
Mm-hmm.
Effective use of wicked science requires that policymakers acknowledge that control is limited and the future is unknown. Effective politics provides room for dissent and disagreement about policy options and includes a broad range of stakeholders. So, a very different approach than the manufactured speaking consensus and the speaking consensus to power approach.
I love how you've framed it as a Venn diagram here, where it really shows that you're acknowledging that there is science and politics are not inseparable, right? That's not what you're advocating for.
Right.
I think the tame problem framework, where we've kind of framed things in a very simplistic way, is as if those two circles were completely intersecting, right? Completely overlap, as if
Exactly.
science and politics were the same thing, right? And then a kind of knee-jerk reaction would be to, well, let's totally separate science and politics. But what you're saying here is, no, we have to deal with it, but it's hard, and we need to acknowledge that it's hard. We need to acknowledge that it's fundamentally uncertain. We need to acknowledge that we can't afford to oversimplify things, because when we oversimplify things, we actually don't get the outcomes that we really need.
Exactly. Well stated.
So I love the new brand of wicked problems and wicked science. Myself being a PhD in systems science from back in the late 90s, and even back then, there was already a large body of work of system scientists. I know you quoted Gregory Bateson and others in your book, and you draw from cybernetics, and all that stuff goes back, to the 50s and 60s of
Right.
20th
Yeah.
century now, right? So meanwhile, this interdisciplinary stuff seems to always struggle to get traction in our hyper specialization world.
Well, and based on my experience, it's so hard in universities and the funding agencies don't get it, but the private sector gets it.
Right.
Okay, and especially in the analytics field, and that's really embraced AI and risk management, logistics, and all this kind of stuff. They're really, I think that it's happening in the private sector,
Mm-hmm.
but not in the political arena, and unfortunately, not too much in the universities.
Nice. And this is exactly what your book is about.
Exactly.
I would encourage everybody to read the book. It's an incredible book, not just for, what's going on with climate change today and understanding that, but I think it's really a book about kind of the intersection of policy and science and how, you talk about the public health response to the pandemic in there. Another, really fundamentally intractable problem, but yet we still have to do our best to,
Yeah.
balance science and policy together.
Yeah, I included a number of sections on COVID because there are some very interesting parallels and some differences. And the most striking thing is the pandemic played out on a time scale of a few years, where we've seen the climate change from the time scale of several decades. But
Mhm.
there are a number of problems, but those are the two most wicked ones that we have around right now.
Mhm. So I do, since we are the foundation for the study of cycles, I do want to talk just a little bit about the natural climate variability model. And you talk a little bit about it in your book. You talk about the sunspot cycle, right? The 11-year
Yeah.
Schwab cycle, I think it's called, and the Gleisberg cycle. You talk about some ocean current cycles, the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation and the Pacific decadal oscillation. Can you just talk a little bit about these natural variabilities in the climate and also how, you know, the the changes that we've seen in climate are within the bounds, as I understand you're saying, of explanations by natural climate variability. Is that true?
Well, barely. I think there is an impact of human-caused warming, but
Okay.
how much we don't know. Um,
Yeah.
just talking about the sun first. I
Hmm.
mean, the second half of the 20th century saw a millennial scale grand solar maximum.
Right.
Okay,
Hmm.
and scientists poo-poo that. Oh, that just contributed a tenth of a degree or something. Well, they're not including the indirect solar effects. There's a lot of other things, other ways that the sun influences a climate other than just the direct heating, watts
Hmm.
per meter squared or whatever. So,
Hmm.
um,
What are indirect solar
oh,
effects?
I mean, ultraviolet, cosmic rays, things like this,
Mhm.
and then you have um, tidal eff- tidal effects, which are more planetary, and there's lots of
Right.
magnetic field issues, lots of things that just aren't included in the climate models that
And
are
is that just
external.
why aren't they included in the climate
Okay,
model?
but, and that's surprising. Like with regards to magnetic field, if you're a planetary scientist, magnetic field is a really big thing. You know,
Absolutely.
determining what's going on with the planetary atmosphere. In the US, we completely ignored it. And I asked them, well, is anybody modeling the Earth's magnetic field? Oh, no, that's way too complex for us to try to model. Well, we don't know. Now we're talking about a possible magnetic pole reversal. What is that going to do? We have no idea. And the whole research community has been focused on human caused climate change because of the political mandate, and that's where all the funding has been. And we've lost a decade of climate dynamicists, just analyzing the outputs of inadequate climate models, trying to find some sort of adverse impact that they can publicize, get some headlines, and get further funding. It's not a good place for climate science. Um,
Mhm. Yeah,
so,
and you talk about in your book, you actually call it data laundering, where, I mean, to literally say, well, that's too complex, we can't include it in our models, is
oh
an
yeah, the
incredible.
whole climate issue is, the physical climate issue has been framed too narrowly. Just in terms of CO2, with natural climate variability just being noise, and it's
Mhm.
not, on any time scale, really. Once you bring into orbital changes, on down to the interannual variability associated with El Nino and La Nina, there's all sorts of time scales. And volcanic eruptions, for the first time, the IPCC assessment report paid attention to them. And they included a little side box reminding us that in the first half of the 1800s, there were 3 explosive volcanic eruptions, huge ones, including
Mhm.
Tambora, the year without the summer, that dramatically changed the global climate for several decades.
Right.
Okay, and and that happened, and the decade, the century, the last century has been one of the quietest volcanic
Yeah.
periods over the last 2 millennia.
Mhm.
Um, so there's no reason to think that
Right.
the 21st century is going to continue, on this trajectory of, very little volcanic activity. We don't know. It's a complete
Yeah.
wild card.
And going back to your point about framing and moving the goalposts, it's interesting how the reference of, degrees above Celsius, degrees above some level, which was established from the pre-industrial measures, right? So meanwhile, like what was going on back in 1850, when we were pre-industrial? Why was that chosen as the
Okay,
line by which we measure things?
okay. I mean, ideally, you would go back to 1750, which I think sort of demarcates
Do
the
we have
beginning.
good data back
No,
to
we
then?
don't. So that's why they start in the second half of the 1800s. But, we're talking about that period was the end of the little ice age, the coldest period of the last millennia. So if you start from that point and then go forward,
Right.
and you would infer all of the warming was caused by fossil fuel emissions, then you have a much more alarming story to tell. But like I already mentioned, that we had the grand solar maximum in the second half of the 20th century. We had relatively low volcanic activity. Both of these things would relatively warm things. And then in the second half of the 20th century, we also had a shift, a so-called Great Pacific Climate Shift, to the warm phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which
Mhm.
heralded a warming period for the last quarter of the 20th century. So
Mhm.
um, the 20th century climatic record hasn't really been unambiguously um, unraveled to figure out what is human cause versus what's natural. And especially since the solar indirect effects really haven't been accounted for adequately. So that still needs to be done. But nevertheless, we have these inadequate climate models being used as evidence that all the warming is human caused. Well, the climate models don't include the processes that I'm talking about.
About
So,
that headline that I shared earlier about,
right,
temperature higher than in 800,000 years, or no, what was it? Anyway, it's like, who
800,000
was
years.
around, who was around 800,000 years ago taking these measurements?
No, it's like it's propaganda and trying to spin things.
I wanted
But
to share something with you briefly that I thought was relevant here. We'll see if you think it's relevant or not. But on my screen here, let me bring this forward. Hopefully you can see it. Uh, this is an article written by, there's a group called Epsilon Theory, Ben Hunt and Rusty Gwynn. And Rusty was talking about the Goldstein machine. And this is from, 1984, right? Where it's the 2 minutes of hate, where everybody gets to be enraged at whatever the TV is telling you should be angry at. Um, and I thought that the way he framed this was really interesting. Let me see if I can find it here. Yeah. A Goldstein machine is a threat which simultaneously must be destroyed and cannot be destroyed, right?
okay, yeah,
So that is like a mechanism of control, basically, that,
exactly.
when you put forward something that must be destroyed, but literally cannot be destroyed, um, that's when you get this kind of impossible cognitive dissonance situation where, the sad part of it is going back to men cannot be controlled by mere violence, oppression, or tyranny. We must be compelled by our very nature to rush to the defense of those who would control us.
Okay, this looks like a
I thought that
really.
was pretty sobering, framing. Let me bring you
I
back
like
up.
that. Send me a link to that article. I want to.
Yeah, and I know you care about science. This is not, when we frame things in this oversimplified way, when we set up a problem that, has to be destroyed but cannot be destroyed, and then when you combine that with the algorithm driven nature of our media today, and, if it leads, it bleeds. I think the science is really getting lost in all of that.
Oh, for sure. Oh, for sure. And like I mentioned, we've lost a generation of climate dynamicists. So there aren't that many people out there
Because they're
investigating.
not interested in the field anymore because there's nothing interesting going on. Is that
Right.
why?
Well, partly, but the people who are drawn to the field
Mm-hmm.
are
Mm,
activists who are worried
right.
about the impact. Not people who want to study fundamental physics-based, you know, atmospheric and oceanic sciences and
Right.
geophysical sciences. So
Oh,
those people aren't being drawn into our field anymore just because it's been so politicized. So that's very, very unfortunate.
and your emphasis on energy policy, I think that's so important, right? And there's a lot of science there that can be brought to bear, and yet it's being kind of sidelined because fossil fuels are bad somehow, even though we have all these expanding energy needs. And
Well,
energy would be the thing that probably gives us the most resilience, the most
exactly.
anti-fragility to be
Mhm.
able to respond to if there are going to be more catastrophic climate events, which we don't even really know if there will be or not.
Exactly. Exactly. Well said.
So, I guess just to bring it full circle, you know, part of what I think you're describing in this oversimplification is also kind of a focus on linearity and mechanism as being the only things that we can really use to ultimately control things. You talk about the fallacy of control, and this model that is, authentically part of science, um, is doesn't give us, the full picture of what's going on. Can't describe the real systems that we're living in, can't explain them, and yet we're still caught in this very oversimplistic, linear, mechanistic worldview.
Yeah, well, and this is where complexity science comes in, where the cause and effect are not easily untangled. Okay, when
Yes.
you have, you can poke it, in one place and get all sorts of unanticipated responses. And so it's really complexity science needs to be brought to the forefront more for these problems because thinking that you can control that there's simple cause and effect and that you can control is just very misleading.
I'm curious what you think of AI today and the new developments in AI, and if that gives you hope, or concern, or both.
Well, my podcast yesterday was with um, Sooth Seeker. It's a
Okay.
podcast that's really related to analytics, big data, and AI.
Okay.
And so we had quite an interesting conversation, but
Mhm.
there's tremendous opportunity and potential here. And I see this really being driven in the private sector. The university is really are way behind on this.
Mhm.
It's being driven in the private sector, and it's happening at a very rapid pace. Um, Tremendously exciting opportunities. All this needs a huge amount of energy, electricity,
Absolutely.
which is a challenge. The Trump and whatever your politics, this is one thing that is on the radar screen of Doug Burgum, Trump's energy czar, of making sure that the AI centers have enough electricity.
Mm-hmm.
So, no, it's an exciting time. There's tremendous potential, tremendous potential.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the old ways of thinking, the old ways of doing things are going to rapidly roll off the page. At least I hope.
I hope so. I do have one concern myself, which is I think a lot of what you are advocating for, and you use the term human centric, right? Like
Mhm.
problems are local, solutions are local. We need to build resilient communities. We need to be able to respond in a way. We need to make sure we don't have perverse policy incentives where, we're subsidizing rich people living on coastal areas, through state run insurance programs, et cetera, right? And
Yeah.
I have a concern with the way AI is developing these massive models run by, massive technology corporations that in some way it's not human centric. That we're looking to the machines to solve our problems instead of really empowering people locally to solve their problems.
Yeah. Well, I think where AI is going to have its impact as people figure out how to effectively use it. Just throwing up our hands, well, AI can't solve it, or AI says this. No, that's not the right approach. I mean, humans have to figure out how to use AI as a stepping stone to
Yes,
figuring things out.
it's
And
a tool.
yeah, it's a tool. I mean, it just has to, I mean, it's like, yeah, it's like, computers and the internet, computers and automation, all the stuff that we thought was going to happen in the 50s and 60s, that didn't happen.
Hmm.
It was going to destroy everybody's jobs. It was all going to be done by computers. Well, of course, it hasn't happened. They became an exceedingly useful tool. So, I mean, I see that. I mean, that's how the AI revolution will proceed. These tools
Hmm.
will help expand our reach and our scope and our abilities to do more, bigger, and better things.
And last question, since you are in the scientific community, I'm interested, are there other active interdisciplinaries of research around natural variability, what I would call cycles?
Um, I don't know. I mean, it's a subfield. People
Hmm.
do the oceanographic community
Hmm.
um, looks into this in solar physics, planetary science. There are people looking at this.
Hmm.
Nicola Scafetta, he's somebody that he would, I think, fit in to your podcast.
Okay,
Um,
great.
I would contact him. Yeah, there are people, doing this research, but it's not really at the level that it should be, given its fundamental intellectual interest, not to mention its societal relevance. So, just everything has been so focused
Yeah.
um, on the fossil fueled warming.
I mean, I think cycles are connected with nonlinearity, right? And I think it's also connected with just living systems in general. And I think that the way that we tend to think about how we understand our world today, right? It's
Yeah.
like life is sort of an accident instead of something to be focused on as a primary um, value, really. You
Yeah.
know. So, well, Dr. Curry, it's been fantastic spending a little time with you, learning about your work. I appreciate your courage out there and your principles and the path that you've been on. And I really appreciate your book. Look, everybody, you know, I really read it. And I encourage everybody else to get a copy of it and read it too. I think it's a fantastic work with relevance, not just to um, what's going on with climate, but relevance to how science and policy interact in our world today. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed talking with you.
And where's the best place for people to keep track of you and your work today?
Well, I'm on Twitter or X
Okay.
at Curry JA. I have a blog called Climate Etc. JudithCurry.com.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm on LinkedIn.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It's really been great speaking with you, and I hope we get a chance to talk again soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.